if I told you that the world was gonna end, I make you hit the together to spend with me or your friends. Would you take the first?
Welcome in to Fantasy 15, a podcast meant to answer all of your fantasy football questions, or as many as I can get to in 15 minutes. I'm your host, Zack, and as always, we've only got 15 minutes. We're officially on the clock. Last week, we looked at rookie quarterbacks, and this week we're getting into rookie running backs. I'm not going to try and predict landing spots for these guys because I've seen them going pretty much everywhere. Big shout out today to Angelo-FF for hooking me up with their Twitter thread that gave me a great starting place with my research on some of these guys for today's show. The first guy I want to talk about is Dillon out of Boston College. Now, he's more of a power running back. There's some comps to Derrick Henry, but he's about 3 inches shorter. He's a real downhill runner. He finishes forward almost all the time. And something that you really notice watching him on film is that he's got a huge lower body. He just looks big. He's very hard to bring down. There weren't very many times that one guy could get him down. He did have very limited involvement in the passing game. He often wasn't even in routes. He was blocking. His blocking is above average because of that, because he was mostly used as a blocking back in the passing game. He only had 21 receptions over 3 years at Boston College as a starter. He went over 1,000 yards all 3 of those years at BC. He broke the career rushing yards. He had over 1,500 yards twice. He had a career average of 5.2 yards a carry. He's a grinder. He's going to pound the ball. He's probably not going to be a workhorse back anywhere, but he's a very nice piece as a running back by committee guy. He could go in and fit in nicely someplace like Philly, where they have more of a scat back, more of a receiving back with Miles Sanders. He had double-digit touchdowns all 3 seasons. He broke Boston College's career touchdown record. The ACC is a weaker football conference when it comes to the overall conference. I know he looked good against Clemson, but overall the ACC is weaker, so you have to take that into consideration as well when you look at A.J. Dillon. Overall, though, he's a nice running back. I don't know how he'll work for fantasy purposes. I would probably stay away from him in PPR, but he's nice buy in Dynasty with the hopes that maybe someday he'll be able to take like a Derrick Henry role and really just get you so many yards that it's well worth it. The next guy I want to talk about is Cam Akers out of Florida State. And he's pretty balanced. He's got a good receiving skill set. His hands in traffic are really great. He made a lot of tough catches. He had 2,000-yard seasons, averaged 4.9 yards a carry. He had lower TD totals up until last year. The argument has always been with Akers that Florida State had a bad offensive line. He also had bad quarterback play, but I think Akers has a lot of ability to be a major bust because of that. Everyone is looking at his offensive line and saying he had very little blocking, but he didn't do a lot for himself. He does deliver some big hits. He likes to lower the shoulder. He's not afraid of contact. He does have the ability to make something out of nothing. He's really good in space. But with a bad offensive line, he was still decent. But there's a lot of questions with him. He didn't get used very well. He has very weak play action, kind of fakes. He's underutilized in the passing game at Florida State, so hopefully that skill set will actually be there. He had very questionable pass blocking when he was asked to do it. Oftentimes he uses his shoulder or just dives, and a running back that can't pass block is one of the reasons that a rookie doesn't get used a whole bunch. Like I said, I think he is a potential bust because he doesn't really pop on film. He doesn't really stand out, and it could be just because the offense looks bad, but I think it's because Akers isn't as good as everybody thinks he is because he put up those big combine numbers. The next guy I want to talk about is Clyde Edwards-Helaire out of LSU. He has a smaller build. He's a shorter back. He's got great receiving out of the backfield. He's a real mismatch for linebackers. He's really too quick, makes some great cuts once he gets into the second level. He had over 450 receiving yards last year. He had over 1,400 yards rushing, a 6.6 yards per attempt average. He's really tough to bring down. He spins through a lot of tackles, and he's great at breaking early backfield contact. He's a guy that I think could be a steal in the draft because I think he's going to go a little bit lower than the top 3 or 4 picks. But I think he's got the potential to be a great back in the NFL. Hopefully it wasn't just the system. I talked about this last week with Joe Burrow. He had about 70 more carries last year, but more than 700 yards difference. So maybe it was that offensive system. He only had 11 receptions in 2018, and last year he was all the way up to 55. He was one of Burrow's favorite targets. He stood out even on the Burrow film when I was watching stuff for Joe Burrow. I took notice of him. He's electric. He seems like there's big play opportunity every time he gets the ball in his hands. The next guy I want to talk about is DeAndre Swift out of Georgia. There's talk about him being the first running back off the board, and I think it's reasonable. He's a pretty balanced back. He's got a mix of everything on film. You see power, you see speed, you see elusiveness, you see some receiving. He's got a really good receiving skill set. He had 17 receptions, 32 receptions, 24 receptions over the last 3 years. And he made a few over-the-shoulder catches, which shows that true receiving ability, those true hands. He didn't have to look everything in. He had over 1,000 yards both seasons he was the starter at Georgia, a school that typically uses more of a running back by committee approach. He had under 200 attempts both of those seasons. There was a split backfield in 2018 with Elijah Holyfield, though, and Holyfield didn't even get really any work in the NFL, so that's kind of a red flag. He had 6.6 yards per carry average on the career. He's pretty shifty. He's got the ability to change directions pretty quickly, and he's smart. He sets up his moves with a lot of false steps. He's got a really killer jab step where he'll get you going one way and then completely plant and push off, and he's gone. He runs through a lot of arm tackles. He's really tough to bring down, a lot tougher than you'd think. He doesn't seem like, until you sit back and kind of start totaling how many tackles he's broken, that he's the guy that's breaking a ton of tackles, but he does. And he makes real highlight reel plays. You can just put one of his games on, and you'll see 2, 3, 4 times where he just makes a play, and you're like, oh my gosh, this guy's electric. This guy's awesome. I expect DeAndre Swift to be one of the top 3 running backs drafted this year. The next thing I want to talk about is Eno Benjamin out of Arizona State, and he's more of a receiving back. He had 42 receptions last season. He had heavy usage in college, 335 touches, 295 touches in 2018, 2019. He was 100 yards shy of a 2,000-yard all-purpose season in 2018. He is not a power guy. We talked about Dillon being a power guy. Benjamin is the complete opposite almost. He's not going to break a bunch of tackles. He's much better in space than he is in traffic. He has trouble if there's no running lane. If there's nothing there for him, he hits up into it and doesn't really get anything because he's not breaking tackles. He's more elusive than fast. He doesn't really rely on straightaway speed, but the jump from 2019 to 2018, he did look like he was much faster. He did look like he improved a little bit there. He looked better than Akers, if I'm being honest, and that could be because Arizona State's offense was a little bit more fluid, a little bit better, but I think it might be because he's just a little bit better of a back. He's going to be a value pick for sure. He'll be part of a running back by committee because of that receiving skill set, and he's not really a guy who's going to make his own yards, but he could have the upside of like an Austin Eckler a year or two from now. So I think he's worth a late round pickup. I wouldn't spend one of my first 3 picks at running back on him, but I think he's going to surprise some people. The next I'm talking about is J.K. Dobbins out of Ohio State, and he's got great numbers. He was over 2,000 yards in 2019, including the playoffs, a 6.7 yards per carry average, 5,104 scrimmage yards over the 3 years he was at Ohio State. He's the all-time leading rusher for a single season at Ohio State with 1,970 yards. He beat out Eddie George, who had 1,927, and Zeke Elliott, who had 1,878. He had decent usage in the passing game. He's really dangerous in the open field after the catch, and that's where you see those passing skill sets really shine. He has a quick step. He gets upfield fast. He's really decisive. When he decides he's going to turn it up, he turns it up, and there's the chance that he's gone with that first step. He's really hard to get hands on in the open field. Because of that, he doesn't take any big hits. He can beat you in a variety of ways. Like I said, he's really slippery. It always seems that he gets more yards than there visually is for him to get. You see him, you're like, oh, he's going to get stopped, and then he'll get 2, 3, 4 more yards. He has really good finishing speed. He had a 68-yard touchdown run against Clemson. He had another long run later in that game. He got tripped up on. Sometimes he gets too cute with moves, though. Sometimes he tries to dance a little bit too much. He suffered a significant high ankle sprain, though, in the college football playoff against Clemson. He went down in the game, came back, still was obviously bothered, went down again, and then kind of toughed it out through the end. That shows a lot of toughness to play in that big game situation, but he said he was still bothered by it, still wasn't back to 100% by the combine, and that's why he didn't participate. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on with Dobbins, but I think he's a lock for a top 3 running back spot. The next guy I want to talk about is probably my running back 1 right now, Jonathan Taylor out of Wisconsin. He had massive college production. He was only 23 yards shy his freshman year of having 3 2,000-yard seasons. He was 1 carry shy of 3 300 carry seasons. He had double-digit touchdowns every season. 21 touchdowns in 2019. He increased his role in the passing game this past year, went from 8 his freshman year, 8 his sophomore year, all the way up to 26. The scheme that Wisconsin runs doesn't really lend itself well to a pass-catching running back. I know James White went there, but that's just not the offense they run now. And Taylor has a lot of tools. He's got really great vision, really good awareness. He plays like a veteran. You can see him kind of reading gaps, reading the situation, watching plays develop, and then making smart decisions at the second level to figure out where he needs to go. The thing that stood out most at the combine for Taylor was his speed. He ran a 4.39 40, led all running backs, which is surprising because of his size. He's 5'11", 219. That puts him slightly taller and slightly heavier than both Dobbins and Swift, the other 2 guys that are considered a top running back. He doesn't take big hits. He's really good at avoiding direct contact. He finishes his runs moving the pile. He has the ability to turn a 3-yard run into a 10, 15, 20-yard run because he's really hard to bring down, and he's great at using his blockers. You can see him put his hands on guys' backs and kind of direct them on where he's going so they know which way to turn the defender. He seems to be a very passable receiver. He didn't have a major role, like I said, in college because of their system, but if you saw the videos of his pro day, he looked really good, looked pretty fluid. It seemed pretty natural to him. The big question with Taylor, though, is there too much wear and tear? Did he suffer too much work at Wisconsin? He had no major injuries in college, so I'm going to say no. There's also this worry of the Wisconsin running back because Wisconsin typically has great offensive line play. You see guys like Monty Ball, Ron Dane come out, and they're pretty much NFL busts. The good news is, though, we see Melvin Gordon, who's still kind of relevant in the NFL. James White, obviously he's playing a much different role, but he's very relevant in fantasy football. So I think Jonathan Taylor is going to be useful in fantasy for years to come. The next guy I want to talk about is Keyshawn Vaughn. And he's a 4-year player, which is kind of a red flag when you look at running backs because the top running backs usually come out early. It might be because he transferred. He transferred from Illinois. He got the bulk of carries his freshman year and then was beat out his sophomore year and then transferred to Vanderbilt for his junior and senior season. He had 1,000 yards in both of those seasons, which was in the SEC. The SEC defenses are typically harder to come by, or opportunities typically harder to come by. He did more last year than he did this year. So in 2018, he had a little bit better numbers, over 200 more yards on 40 less carries in 2018 than in 2019. He's really good at yards after contact. He got contacted early pretty often because his offensive line wasn't stellar, but he's good at getting out of that early contact. He has really good burst speed. He had a couple of nice runs against LSU. With a seam, he can make a play very big in a hurry. He struggles more than anybody I watched film on, and it could be because there wasn't a whole bunch of talent on the Vandy offense. It's not really clear. I think he's a guy that is worth the risk because he's got some talent, but I don't know that he's going to lock up a major role as a running back for fantasy purposes. The last guy I'm going to talk about is Zack Moss out of Utah. He was a 4-year player too. Like I said, top running backs usually come out early. Maybe it's because he had an injury. He actually injured himself climbing into bed, which could be a possible issue. They said that he had injured himself in game and actually aggravated it getting into bed. There was clearly something that hobbled him at the combine as well. It led to low numbers. He later went back on his pro day and improved upon those. He had 1,000 yards the last 3 seasons at Utah, double-digit touchdowns the last 3 seasons, decent usage in the passing game, a pretty big dip his junior season. down to 8 receptions, but other than that, he was pretty consistent. He doesn't look as fast as the other running backs. He's closer to Dillon when it comes to speed. He's got really good power moves, a great stiff arm that just kind of locks guys right in place. He dances a little bit too much for me, and it's how he reads the play. It's how he reads the hole. He's usually waiting for things to develop when he's doing that, but he makes a lot of false cuts, a lot of extra footwork, and it just kind of slows him down overall. There's lots of lateral movement instead of going north and south and hitting that hole. And for that reason, I think Zach Moss, I've seen him being ranked as high as running back 4, and I think that's a little bit too high for him. That's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining me. Please subscribe, comment, rate, review, share, scream from the rooftops to spread the word about this podcast. And be sure to follow on Twitter, Fantasy15, that's Fantasy, ONEFIVE, on Facebook at facebook.com/fantasy15, and email any questions to fantasy15@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. See you next week.